Welcome to another podcast. Today I have Debbie Foster. Debbie is, in simple terms, a bird trainer, but she's got a lot more more pedigree behind that as well. So Debbie, without kind of jumping into too much about you from what I know, which is very little, welcome.
Thank you.
If you could kind of elaborate on the introduction, like what is your background? I know you have a master's degree in education and so on, but like tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I have this theory that people don't have to grow up to be just one thing, and I'm the walking poster child for that. So you're right. I do have a master's degree in education in speech pathology, and that is what I did at the elementary, middle, high school, college, and special ed and institutional settings for a number of years, which is still communication, right? And about 20 years ago, I had a new parrot to my home. I've always had birds, but I had a new guy, and there was a store that opened in Pineville. And when I went and met them, that started a whole different path. It's truly amazing how much that one little meeting impacted where I've been for the last 20 years. So over the last 20 years, I have accrued a variety of different certifications, not just in animal training. I do avian training. I'm certified by the International Association of Avian Trainers and Educators as a trainer. I'm also certified by the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants, and I work with parrots there in that particular division. I am a co-instructor or teaching assistant for Living and Learning with Animals, which is an 8-week webinar for professionals offered twice a year by Dr. Susan Friedman, who I consider to be my primary mentor. And I also teach for the Companion Animal Sciences Institute in their parrot division, and it's an online virtual master's level program.
Okay, so quite a bit, quite a bit
a
of
few
different
things.
Yeah, and so you were in education in the beginning. How did you decide to pursue education when you were like in high school, or like what was your thought process like back then to figure out what you want to do with your life?
In high school, I intended to be a forest ranger. So very different, right? Mm-hmm. And once I started attending college, I really liked the communications classes. And I took one special ed class that focused on speech pathology, and that was it. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and so I went in that direction. And I remember my mom saying to me not that long ago, all that education and you're working with birds. I said, but Mom, I'm using that education. I'm communicating with birds non-verbally. That's how they communicate. And I'm using those skills I learned as a speech pathologist to do that.
Okay. So back then, it sounds like you really liked nature, like animals, plants, things like that.
Yeah.
Where do you feel like that love for nature came from?
My grandparents, specifically my grandmother, and I know because we've talked about this on my podcast, what happened in your background. And they were farmers. They had a dairy farm, and they would have a massive breakfast really early in the morning because cows had to be milked, and they would have a massive lunch, which they called dinner. And then everybody had a little nap after dinner, and they had just cold stuff from the table at supper. But after the nap time at lunch, my grandmother would say, let's go for a walk. And we would hike out through the woods. We would go down to what they called the branch, which is a small creek. And we would hike the pastures and just see what we could see. And that's where I got my start. And it's interesting because, again, I don't think you have to be just one thing when you grow up. So I have a lot of environmental certifications. So I still have that segment very much alive and well in my life.
Yeah, so I feel like I have something in common with you in that. Like I grew up, it wasn't a big farm or anything like that, but I guess I didn't really grow up. I lived in Ukraine up until I was 10 years old, and where we lived, it was a small town, but not everybody, but almost everybody, or at least some families had like livestock, like animals in their home. It's kind of odd looking at the American lifestyle compared to that, because you have people who don't have much livestock, but then you have others that have chickens, they have cows, they have whatever, ducks or things like that. So I kind of grew up around animals like that as well. And when we moved to U.S., I was in 4th and 5th grade. And back then I was like, really was drawn to nature as well. And I was like, when you mentioned forest ranger, that's what I was thinking of going into, or like I don't know any better or whatever, but like I was like I heard about forestry and forest rangers and so on. I was like, maybe I'll do that. It didn't quite work out that way,
Yeah.
but but I feel like I have something a little bit in common with you. And actually, the reason why I brought you on the podcast was because I would like to get a bird, but before getting a bird, I really want to find out more information behind, like, what is it like keeping the bird. I've had birds before. I've had parakeets, like way back when I was a child. But like I wanted to get a bigger bird to be more of, like, to be able to interact with them more, like a smarter bird or that kind of thing. And I wanted to know a lot more about that. So maybe we can get into that a little bit more. But before that, so you liked nature and so on. And then in college, though, you didn't quite go into that path, though. You went into education. So how did that transition from like wanting to be around nature change to education?
Part of it was I would have had to transfer to a different college in order to go into the forestry program, and that would have been away from the Atlanta area where I grew up. The closest one was Athens, which was probably a couple of miles away. By that time, I had met my would-be husband, and so that didn't hold as much appeal. And again, I'd started taking some of those classes in communication and thought, maybe this is what I'm supposed to be doing. At this point in time, at any rate, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Okay. So is like one thing led to another, and opportunities, like it's almost like drawing on the paper, right? You have a blank sheet of paper, you can draw anything, but once you put something on there, you have to kind of work with what you have.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what was your experience like going through college, specifically in the education field?
It's changed a lot in the last 20 years or so. I do know that because I still kind of keep in touch with people who are in that role. If you were a speech pathologist, and this is in the a suburb of Atlanta that I grew up, it was the largest, fastest growing school system in the United States at that point in time in Gwinnett County. And so as a speech pathologist, you didn't generally have just one school. You might have as many as 3. That was one of the things I didn't find appealing, because if you're dealing with 3 schools, 3 different age groups potentially, 3 different sets of faculty and administrators, and potentially 3 different schedules, you don't have a lot of personal relationships in those schools, and that was not a lot of fun. And I felt like I was always just running for my car, and I didn't enjoy that. Once we moved from the Atlanta area to Mississippi, I chose not to go into the educational field at that point again. And when we moved here, I again chose not to do it.
What did you do when you moved to Mississippi? What did you do at that time?
I ran a federal fundraising campaign called the Combined Federal Campaign, and it's for any federal employee. We lived in a very small town in Mississippi called Columbus. There were about 30,000 people, and it didn't seem that big, but we had an Air Force base there, and that was really interesting to be that close to military. We had people living in our neighborhood. There was a church on the base that I sang at one point. They would put out the Catholic markers, for lack of a better word, and then it was time for another denomination to use a space. They'd take it down and put up their things. So yeah, I did the fundraising campaign, and that was great. I made a lot of contacts that way and got to meet a lot of the military people, which I really enjoyed.
And then you moved to Charlotte after that. And what did you start picking up here?
When we moved to Charlotte, my husband was traveling a lot, and my son was just going into 6th grade. So I didn't do a lot at that point in time. I didn't have even a part-time job. I did a lot of volunteer work. After how many years? Oh, gosh. It's funny. I don't even remember at this point. 5, 7 years maybe. I worked for a variety of different things. I worked for a jeweler who made her own jewelry in Matthews. That was a fascinating process. I like jewelry. I had no experience with anything, but I like it. So that worked really well for a while. And then I thought, I kind of miss teaching. And so I went back to CPCC. I applied there, and they said, yes, we've got an opening right now. And so I taught there for 13 years in their communications department. But I also worked with them to certify the campus as a wildlife habitat through National Wildlife Federation. I worked with them to create a pollinator garden on that campus. So once again, I'm dabbling in all those areas that have always interested me.
Yeah. And what was it like bringing new programs to life within the college?
It was wonderful. There was another person that kind of spearheaded it, and he and I have worked together in a variety of capacities. And we expected to run into some pushback, and instead they were absolutely wonderful. He was responsible for getting all 7 campuses certified as wildlife habitats for CPCC. And basically, any idea we came up with and pitched got approved. It was wonderful. I remember one time we the pollinator garden was going on. We had gotten some plants donated, and I looked at this one plant that's one of my very favorite plants, and I thought, I think a trip to the dean's office is in order, because this plant has leaves that some people might mistake for pot. So I thought, before we start a big rumor on campus, I'm just going to go and say, see that plant down there? It is not pot. This is what it is. This is why it's there.
Yeah. And what does it mean to be wildlife habitat kind of certified? What does that mean?
It means that you provide food, water, shelter, and places to raise young, and commit to sustainable gardening practices. And those, the food, water, shelter, or cover can be the other name, and places to raise young, are things that can be naturally occurring in your yard, or you can augment them or put them there deliberately as a man-provided thing. So, for example, if you have trees and shrubs, you have places for birds to raise young, but not all birds use trees and shrubs. So if you add a bluebird house, for example, you might add other places for birds to raise young. And the same thing with food. Yeah, you can hang out feeders, but right now I haven't had any food in my feeders in at least 6 months, because I have natural food in my yard. I have berries and seeds and nuts and pollen and nectar, so I don't feel the need to run out and fill feeders on a regular basis.
Have them kind of naturally learn how to fend for themselves.
Yeah, we don't have to teach them that. That's instinctive on their part.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier you went to a pet store, and that's when you got into like parrots and training. Like, yeah, tell us the story of that.
It's actually the store that you contacted. So you called Parrot University in Pineville, North Carolina. That's their for-profit store. So they sell, I call it a one-stop shopping experience for parrot people, because if you need a cage, they sell cages and purchase and toys and food and. But they also have a nonprofit there called Companion Parrots Rehomed. And the birds, I don't think you've been to the location. You need to go visit. Yeah. They've got right now, I'm just guessing, 60, 80 birds of all different sizes. The smallest ones are about 2 inches and the biggest ones are about 4 feet. And so those two organizations are inextricably entwined. And so I went in there and just thought, wow, I have found my people. I've found people I can ask questions. I now know where I can get supplies from, because I didn't really know that in this area. And in general, you don't want to go to a big box pet store for any number of reasons. And so I ended up hitting it off with everybody and said, I will donate some volunteer time. So what do you need me to do? And I don't remember what I started as, but because I never taught in the summer when my son was out of school, I told the owner, I said, well, I've got more time than I had, and I would like to come down and volunteer some more. And here's what I think I should do. I don't know anything about training. I don't. But it makes sense to me that the birds would be better off with someone giving them one-on-one attention and attempting to teach something than not having either of those conditions. And she said, okay. So I started doing that, loved it. Oh my gosh, it's so much fun. You shouldn't be paid for things you have this much fun with. And after a while, she said, you have a real facility for this. Can I send you for training? And I said, sure. So she sent me to a ranch in Florida, which I have probably been to 5 or 6 times at this point. She sent me to Oregon. She sent me to Maryland, There's others I can't remember, but I repeated some of those. And that really put me in touch with some people that I didn't know at the time were big names. They're at the top of their field. They're still around today, and I am really good friends with many of them. And it was such an experience. You never know where you're going to end up.
Yeah. So how long ago was that when you started?
That was probably about 18, 19 years ago.
Okay. And I mean, since then, you've become, I guess we could call it a professional, right? A professional trainer.
Absolutely.
What have you noticed in that field? Like how some people train animals, and more specifically birds, and how you go about training? What's the difference?
Yeah. 20 years ago, positive reinforcement was just starting to be something that you would hear frequently, but not necessarily understood. And now it's a standard. People are expected ethically to train using positive reinforcement and not to train using force, pressure, coercion, punishment. So the science is out there now. When I teach my classes, I teach the science. When I work with my clients, I use the science and talk to them about the science, because I want them to understand this is not a fad. It's not my opinion. This is based on huge amounts of research across the board with multiple species. These studies are replicated so that they check to see if they get the same results. This is a standard now, instead of a kind of a pie in the sky idea that made people feel warm and fuzzy maybe, but wasn't well understood.
And like when you go about training, what is your process like? Like what do you do? Like if you get a new bird, I don't know, let's say that it hasn't been trained, maybe it's young but has a few months or something. Like where do you start? What do you do?
Okay. Well, to begin with, you would start at the same place regardless of the age of the animal, regardless of the background of the animal, because animals learn throughout their lives. If they don't survive in the wild. They have to continually learn where the food source is, who the predators are, where they would be, and do things to act in a manner that will perpetuate the species. So it doesn't matter to me. In fact, I frequently don't know how old the birds are. People ask me, how old is that? Is it a male or female? So I don't know. Doesn't matter. I'm going to train it the same way. So I do an evaluation. I want to see when I'm in that animal's proximity, and we would have to define that. With some animals, it might be 20 feet away. With some animals, it might be right at the cage. What's their body language telling me? Are they staying in place? Are they leaning toward me? Are they showing relaxed body language? And for some birds, that might be standing on one foot or eating while I'm standing by them. We have to make sure when we use those labels, we operationalize them in behavioral terms. And from there, I usually do a meet and treat. That's my term for it. I have a huge variety of food items, and I will start to usually hold up 2 at a time. And I want them to orient. So if I've got a sunflower seed in one hand and a piece of walnut in the other, which one do they swing their head to? And I'll test that a couple of times, and then I will reverse which hand that treat is in, because I want to make sure they're not just always swinging to the right, regardless of what's in my hand. Yeah. So if I put it in my left hand and they continue to orient there, I can say that they like whatever they're orienting to. And when I find that food reinforcer that the animal will behave to attain, then I am also going to protect that reinforcer. So I am going to take that out of the diet. They're not going to get it because they're just cute. They're going to work to earn that. And studies have shown that birds will pass by free food in order to work for their food. So there's science again.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely insightful. So as far as the industry, like the bird industry, the pet industry, but more specifically about birds, what have you noticed about the industry, the goods and the good and the bad and so on? Like what's great about it and what's not so good about it?
When I was, maybe 10 or 11, we were on vacation, and I don't know why we went into something like maybe a Woolworth, some big, you could get everything there, including pets. So I went in there and walked up to their birds, because I've always loved birds, and saw dead birds in the bottom of the cage. And I saw water bowls that had nothing in them. burst into tears, but was determined at that age I was going to take a stand. And I found an employee and said, I want to speak to your manager. And they tried to run a block, but it didn't work. So when they came over, I pointing all these things out. This is not acceptable. These animals died of thirst. What is wrong with this? Yeah. And so that was, but they were considered only birds at that point in time. They weren't considered to be intelligent, and the smaller the bird, the least intelligent, less intelligent they were considered to be. Now we know that's all wrong. And so that was one of my first starts. And then as we moved around the country from Georgia to Mississippi to North Carolina, I've had a chance to see different organizations, nonprofit rescues, things like that in action. Of course, they're not all created equal. Some are better than others, and so are the stores. Mm-hmm. I actually, with a store in the Matthews area, they know my background. And so when I go in there, if I want to work with their birds for free, I'm willing to donate it. I have permission to do that. And the manager recently said, every time you come in here, I learn something new. And so they're sharing that with their customers who buy these birds, and the people have more information than they would have had I not done that. So that to me is a step in the process. It's always a process. It's not a once and done thing. It's a journey of many steps.
Yeah. And recently there was a summit. I forget the name of it. I actually joined in a couple hours or whatever in there. And they were talking about birds and like trying to keep the birds free and wild instead of having people like own them. What's your view on that just overall?
Yeah, that ship has sailed, unfortunately. So if the birds are still in the wild, they need to stay in the wild, and they need to be afforded protection. A lot of our birds have at least decreasing populations if they're not, in fact, endangered. So we need to think about that. The U.S. banned importation of parrots in 93 or 94. And they may still be smuggled in some cases, but far less. Now we have people breeding them, though. And so we've got to kind of look and say, what would they be doing in the wild? How can we give them as much of that as we can in our home? So let's take a bird who's flighted, for example. In the wild, that bird might fly 20 miles to locate food. Consume the food 20 miles back where it came from. It might do it again later that day, or it might go searching for water. Even if a bird is flighted in our home, they're not flying the equivalent of 20 miles one way to find food. And then regarding the food, we put the food in these magic silver bowls. That's not realistic. I mean, they have to hunt for their food in the wild. So by today's standards, we encourage people to teach their birds to forage and to make it harder and harder and harder, because that's how they spend their time in the wild.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that eventually people won't own birds at all, or like what do you think?
I suspect that that's not going to happen, that there are enough people to mount a defense against not having birds. I know of some people that are doing conservation breeding for endangered species. We want that. A lot of the zoos do that now. So we want that because they may be what saves a species. Mm-hmm. So we can't just say, let's get rid of all of them. But we can say, well, if they're here, how can we give them the very best life possible?
And in there's different, like, I don't know if they're sanctuaries, but they're also where public comes in and views or sees the birds. There's one, I believe it's called Bird Kingdom in Ontario. I don't know if you ever went there, Niagara Falls area.
No, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that one.
I went there I took my kids there a while ago. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little less. But it was really, really nice. It's an enclosed structure. It's I don't know what you want to call it, like a building.
An aviary?
I guess. And where the birds freely fly, but they're inside. Mm-hmm. They're not outside. So they have all kinds of birds flying around, walking around. They have some fish, some little fish thing there, and then some kind of plants or whatever. So is that what you were talking about as far as a sanctuary, or what were you kind of describing there?
You're going to get different definitions for the word sanctuary is what I think. There are always some people who label themselves one thing and they may in fact be another. So sanctuaries in general do not breed those birds. They're giving these birds a life for the remainder of their life.
Okay.
But they're not contributing to the problem of birds that need homes. Most people have no idea that I think parrots are the third largest pet size demographic in the United States. And the average parrot, and I can't quote the source on this, so this is something I'm picky about, has 6 homes in its lifetime. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you drop a parrot off at, say, Animal Control or the Humane Society, they're probably not going to have somebody who understands how parrots differ from, say, dogs and cats, okay? And it's really important that those birds have a way that someone can interact with them appropriately, and whoever wants to adopt them needs to have the education. So it's a catch-22. We want to do the best we can. We want to certainly keep species from going extinct. They should never have been brought in as pets. But hey, that ship sailed a long time ago. Past presidents from the 1800s had parrots.
So if somebody is thinking of having a parrot as a pet, what would you advise? Like what should they do before?
Yeah, so I actually work with people who adopt, Amazons, eclectus, cockatoos, macaws, sometimes African greys, anything in the Poicephalus family. So that's going to include red-bellied parrots and, drawing blanks on these right now, Cape parrots or brown-necked parrots and Senegals. And we sit down and we talk about what parrot life is like, what the wild parrot of this particular species would be doing in the wild, how this parrot is still not domesticated. That's the other thing people don't know. Dogs and cats have been domesticated for tens of thousands of years. Parrots are only a couple of generations out of the wild. They are not domesticated animals at this point in time. So they behave differently. So we talk about that, and then I spend a second half of my consultation with people actually giving them up close, personal, I don't want to say hands-on because that's misleading. I want people to keep their hands away from the birds. But we're going to be working with that bird either in or out of the cage, depending on the individual bird. We're going to be teaching that bird some behaviors. So if birds have been chased around with a hand, you can understand why they might not want anything to do with the human hand. Mm-hmm. But we can teach them to step up onto objects instead. And as we're doing that and we're giving them the choice, you can come toward us or you can move away. It's totally your choice. If you make the choice I'm asking, there's something good in it for you. Okay. And we can teach them to step up on different types of perches. We're putting trust in a bank account by giving that bird choice and control and the opportunity to earn something of value to it. So we are really, it's not just a simple process. It's a very diverse, complex relationship that we're working on.
Mm-hmm. And what about like an environment to create for that bird? Like what is needed?
Mm-hmm. You need the largest cage for that particular species. And I want to be really clear here. Not the largest cage you have room for in your home. That's a big difference, okay? These birds need a particular size. So with let's say a blue and gold macaw, their wingspan when they stretch them out is probably 3.5 feet, maybe as much as 4. They need a cage where they can extend those wings and not hit the side. If it's a long-tailed bird, they need a place where they can turn around without jamming their tail on all 4 walls and it doesn't drag the bottom of the cage. They need a height that they're not bumping their heads on. They need to be able to move around. So it's a quandary to get people to say, but that's expensive. Yes, it is. Yep, but it's the right thing to do to give that bird a quality of life. So you're looking at cages. You're looking at toys. This is funny. What birds do in the wild is they chew, they shred, they destroy. And I remember a friend of mine who has done a lot of eco tours said, if you want to find parrots in the wild, look on the ground, find the biggest mess possible, look up. So people bring these birds into their home. They buy toys, which are kind of expensive, and the bird shreds it in a day, 2 days, a week. and they're really upset with their bird because it did something that is natural behavior.
Yeah.
And so I explained to them, you can save money by making your own toys, but that bird just did exactly what he would have done. That is a wild behavior that's happening in our home, and it gave him a way of spending his time. You've taken flight away from these birds, or at least free flight outside. Give them a job to do. So toys, and that's a regular expense that you're going to have to just budget for. Perches have to be replaced as well. They need different types of perches, different diameters, different materials, and those all serve a purpose for the bird. So that's something else. You need to have a good quality food, and you'll get a big debate on that one in the bird world. But we're moving more toward feeding fresh foods for our birds rather than some manufactured product.
Mm-hmm. And outside of that, outside of the housing, the food, I guess we can call it entertainment or something to do for the for the bird and a place to stand. What about flight? Like, should people consider letting their birds fly around in somewhere? Like
Yeah.
what about that? Yeah.
Absolutely, but there's a two-sided answer to that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So in Europe, I don't think they're allowed to trim birds' wings at all. What happens oftentimes in the U.S. is the breeders may pull the babies, they may hand feed the babies themselves, and so the parents don't raise the chicks, and that also means they don't teach the chicks to fly. And then some people will start to trim the flight feathers as soon as they start growing. So this child never learns to do something that's a natural behavior, right? Mm-hmm. So the two sides of that coin are, yes, we should have flighted birds in our home. Absolutely. But we have a huge responsibility. We have to close toilets. We have to not leave water standing in sinks. We have to not leave a hot pot on a stovetop or leave a hot stovetop where the bird can access it. We have to turn off our ceiling fans. We have to watch what that bird is chewing, and if it's electrical cords to your light that's plugged in, yeah. We have to know that anything that's got a strong odor like air fresheners is toxic. Any nonstick cookware is toxic. So, yeah, we should be letting them fly. But if you've got little kids, I remember years ago, 2 vets adopted a small bird, and I don't remember what it was. And I did the home visit at the time, and I said, okay, where are you going to put this bird? They wanted it in the main living area. I said, great. My only concern is you've got a straight flyway from here right to your front door. Mm-hmm. And they said, we'll be really careful. So you got 2 little kids. Yep, we're going to be really careful. That bird got out, and it was just a mistake. It was a horrible accident, but the bird paid for it with his life because the guy got there in time to see a hawk grab the bird.
Wow.
Yeah. So then you have the other side of it where they don't have the ability to fly around. Some people think they should just stay in their cages because that's easier for the person to care for. They don't have to worry if it's eating grandma's antique sideboard that way. The bird doesn't distinguish between that and wood. But it's not a life. It's not a life for this non-domesticated wild animal who is evolutionarily designed to fly.
Yeah. So back in Ukraine, my brother actually raised pigeons,
Mm-hmm.
like homing pigeons. So they're taught, they basically have their place where they live. It was like this little attic part of a barn that
Mm-hmm.
we had or whatever. So they would fly out and fly back, and that was their home. But they were free flying outside,
Right.
anywhere they wanted to fly. And I've seen some people walking around with macaws or other African grays or other birds. So I don't know if they just clip their wings or can a bird be trained in such a way to be fully, be able to fly, knows how to fly, flies around, but knows to come back to you. Is that possible?
Big question there. So their wings potentially could be trimmed, and by wings I mean feathers, not the wing structure itself. And there are right ways to do that allow the bird to glide to the ground, and there are really extreme ways of doing it where if that bird spooks, it drops like a rock and it can land on the keel bone, which is right down the center of the chest. Imagine something that's going to move every time that bird moves. And so with a broken keel bone, that would have to be horribly painful and take a long time to heal. So there's that. But then I would be willing to bet a sizable number of the people that you've seen walking around outside would say to you, my bird would never leave me. And I answer that one with, so if you trip and you're going down, your bird's going to let you land on him and squash him? That doesn't make sense. If a hawk comes in or a dog charges you, your bird's going to stay with you. Okay? Say, I love you, buddy. Probably not. Now, you can do, most people shouldn't do that. I'll preface it with this. I wouldn't do it. I'll preface it with that too. You can teach birds free flight. Okay? You go outside, you fly them. But you need to do that with protected contact inside for a very long time. It is a high-level skill, and I remember a world-renowned trainer saying, don't do it. Most people cannot do this, so just don't do it. Then you need a recall. So if that bird flies away and you can't see it, do you have a sound or a signal that you have trained and trained and trained some more very carefully to get that bird to come back? If that bird's being chased by a predator when it flies, it probably doesn't know what the neighborhoods around yours look like, okay? It doesn't know where it is. It may not know where you are and how to get back. So loaded question, lots of options. And I'll get, you can, if your goal is to take your bird outside, then you can take your bird outside in a carrier, okay? If all you wanted was to take your bird outside, train your bird to go into the carrier, and take your bird outside. I sit with mine in the backyard. He can be showered with a hose in the backyard. We sit together. He lets his feathers dry in the wind and the sun. That's hugely beneficial to a wild animal who's living inside. He can watch the leaves blowing on the trees and the birds coming in. Huge, huge, huge. And then you can take them in the car. My bird's been to parks in the area. He has been to breweries and wineries. He's been all over everywhere, so he gets more than just that place in my home. There's something else for him to do, you know? But we just have to be so careful because the birds should not pay with their lives for, we could call it vanity maybe from us. I want to do this. I remember going to a movie or concert in Stumptown Park in Matthews years ago, and it was really late. It was way after dark. And here comes this guy walking around with an African gray on his shoulder. And it'd been there a while, judging from the poop that was streaming down his back. So that bird would not have been on the move in the dark, in the wild. They go to their roosting spot and they go to sleep there. They don't move around in the dark because it's not a natural behavior for them. Predators would snag them if they're moving around in the dark. But here's this guy in a park with hundreds of people and pitch black dark walking around with this bird.
So he must have had like the feathers clipped or something, or...
Good question.
Don't know.
I remember him. He did attend a workshop at Companion Parrots Rehomed after that, and I recognized him when he came through the door. And the international expert that we had doing that workshop said, "Oh, you don't have your bird in a carrier?" And he said, "No." So I think if I had an international expert ask me a question and clearly trying to let me know that maybe that wasn't the best choice, I would have listened to that, but I don't think that works in this case.
Yeah.
You can harness train your bird too, and I do have a lot of people ask me to do that. It's funny because not all birds are suitable for harness training. And it is not a quick once and done training session. It's an advanced training. There are so many different parts on those harnesses and so many parts on the bird that have to go in the harness, and you don't want to grab the bird, wrestle it to the ground, clamp it under one shoulder, and wrestle it into the harness. That's not how this works. You want to ask the bird, would you like to? Would you come toward me? Would you put your head right up to what I call the head noose? Terrible word, but I've never come up with anything else. Would you like to put your head through the head noose? Would you like to pull your head back out of the head noose? So who's in charge of that? The bird. It's not me. I'm not wrestling that thing on and taking it back off. The bird participates voluntarily. And then we do one wing, and then we do the other wing, and then we have to do the adjustment. And then there's a lot of parts involved in this. And most people simply can't do it. So if their goal is to take their bird outside, great. Get a great carrier and take them outside in the carrier.
Yeah. What are some pros and cons of having a bird?
Wow. I'll start with the pros. It's an amazing experience. We used to think, bird brain was an insult, in this country at least.
Yeah.
And one of my brothers said, I'm going to have to stop calling you bird brain, because he's heard enough on my podcast about the structure and the intelligence of birds' brains. We've learned so much about it. So it's an amazing experience to be with an animal that can have, depending on the research you look at, the intellectual ability of a 5 to 7-year-old child. Our dogs don't do that. Our cats don't do that. Okay, they are amazing learners, and this is amazing to have that experience, to have a wild animal in your home, a non-domesticated animal in your home. So those are amazing. That does not mean it's right for everybody. And it would be a really serious choice to make, not an impulsive, rash decision, a serious choice, because people blame the bird for being a bird. It yelled. Well, how about they do that? That's how they communicate in the wild. Why would they do anything differently in our home? It's shrieking. You've got a hawk in the backyard. That's the flock alarm call, exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It bit me. You just pushed your hand against that bird's chest. It had two choices: fall off or bite you to remove the hand. Okay, you're going to do that again? So there's that. So it is an amazing thing. The con is they are very messy, and people complain about that. So I sweep in my house a fair amount because I give my bird a huge amount of things to chew, to shred, to forage, okay? And a lot of that stuff ends up in the kitchen floor. That's where he is at the time. That's where the stuff's going to end up. You have to change the cage all the time because you want to look for signs your bird is sick. And one of the signs is the poop. So you have to learn to read poop. And if you leave the papers or whatever substrate you're using in the cage for a week, you're not seeing all the fresh poop. It's covered up. It's piled on top of one another. That eventually can become airborne as it dries. That's not healthy for the bird to breathe in or for the people to breathe in. Your bird has to have showers. Your bird has to have good food on a regular schedule. Your bird has to have clean water. You must clean and scrub food and water dishes. So it's, we could consider that to be cons. You can't make an animal be something it is not.
Yeah, so there's a lot of work behind having the bird. Not just,
there should be.
Yeah.
There should be.
Yeah. When it comes to training, what are key things to train the bird? What are the key number of items that are must?
Are you talking about the items you need to use to train the bird?
No.
Or just
I mean
training behaviors.
Behaviors.
Okay.
Behaviors,
So
yeah.
I'm going to tell you this is my opinion based on experience, but I know enough trainers around the world to know that this is going to be a pretty commonly held belief. So most people would think I'm going to answer, teach it to step up. That's not where I'm starting. I want to know, does that animal even want me around it? So if I see a bird that is demonstrating fear, that might be shrieking, it might be flipping off the perch, running away, thrashing. I don't want to see that from a bird. So if I see that, I'm going to treat that bird with kid gloves. I might just walk by, not make eye contact with a bird, and slowly drop a treat in a food bowl and walk away. Okay. Over time, pairing that treat, if I've chosen the right treat, the bird is going to pair that with me. Oh, here she comes. I can get a walnut now. Yay. So that's a step. That's training technically. Okay. Mm-hmm. And once I'm able to get close to that bird, I'm going to start with target training. I start with every single bird I work with using target training. Target training uses some sort of an object, and it asks the bird to touch the object and then to track the object. So I use a chopstick for several reasons. It's untreated wood, so it's safe for the bird. They are about 8 inches long as a rule, 8 to 10 inches, which means there's that much separation between the bird's beak and your fingers. That's a win-win. Okay. A bird can only bite you if a bird can reach you. That's a hard and fast rule. Yeah. And then they're usually cheap or free. So if we go out to eat and they say, "Do you want a chopstick?" I go, "Uh-huh." And my husband does too, and then I bring him home. So I'm going to start by walking very slowly up to that bird. I usually hold the chopstick at my thigh, and as I'm walking up, I'm showing a treat in my other hand, and I'm bringing that chopstick up so slowly that you almost don't even, you're not aware that it's coming up, okay? And when I get it up, it's going to be parallel to the floor, and I'm going to bring it in just near the bird's beak or eyes, but I am not going to touch the bird with that chopstick. The idea is for the bird to touch the chopstick, not for me to touch the chopstick to the bird. Mm-hmm. So if I place it, depending on the size of the bird, anywhere from a half an inch to a couple of inches away, and just wait, the bird will most likely lean out, touch the chopstick, at which point I can say, "Good," and give them a treat. You do not have to say the word "good." And there are probably people thinking right now, "Well, what about a clicker?" Well, if you've got a bird on one hand and stick in the other, and treats, and I don't always have enough hands, but you can click with your tongue. Okay, all that means is that's what I want right there, and it's a promise to pay. So if "good" does it, that's great. You can use a nonsense word. You can say "fish." The bird doesn't care as long as you're consistent and you follow it up with a treat. And then once I get the bird to touch that 3 times in a row, that's just my rule, without hesitation, I'm going to move the chopstick. So I might use the cage bars if the bird is inside the cage, and I might move it 2 bars over because that's a measurement, right? Mm-hmm. And so I can write it down in my training log. Bird moved 8 bars today. Bird moved from one side to the other today. I want them to start leaning toward it. I want them to lean and have to move at least 1 foot from where it is to get to it, then 2 feet, and then I'm going to start moving them around the cage. With birds that haven't been out of cages in years, that we still see a lot of, I can exercise that bird in the cage by saying, "Touch here," and going to the top of the cage, and then diagonally to the bottom and to the left and the right. So that bird that isn't flighted, isn't out, still gets a lot of exercise. He has attention from me. He has the ability to control his reinforcers. He behaves to get away from something. So if I've chosen the right, it's usually food, but not always. Yesterday we were training a bird by yelling, "Woo!" when it did what we wanted it to do. And we know it worked because the bird repeated the behavior. So that's what I'm going to start with, is target training. And then I'm going to start introducing alternative perches to birds, because I want to train 3 or 4 alternative step-ups before we introduce the hand. So I will start usually with a rope perch, and I fold it into an inverted loop so that the bird can step onto the top, and I can hold the edges with my hand. I can use my food hand to lure the bird in that direction at first, and then once they're reliably doing this, I'm hiding the treat in my hand. And once they step onto the perch, I can then slowly and carefully start to move that perch, because the first thing is stepping on. That's one behavior. Moving with the perch is a different behavior, and that's a mistake people make. The bird gets on the perch the very first time and they go running around the house with the bird. Next time they show you that perch, it's unlikely the bird's going to step on it. I will train with a T-perch. I will train with PVC tabletop stands and PVC floor stands as well, because I'm just getting this bird in this process, of the training process, and getting some momentum built up. And then I may, depending on what the bird is showing, start to introduce the hand. I am also going to do what people might label trick behaviors. And all behavior is behavior. We can call it a trick if we want. It's still a behavior. So I will frequently teach birds to do the turnaround. I will teach them to do the retrieve, which is taking an object and putting it into a container. Technically, that's the concept of basketball, right? So I have birds that do play basketball with 2 goals on a table. I also have birds that hang out on top of the cage, and if you give them an object, they'll drop it into your hand. So there's still the same behavior. It just looks a little bit different. And I also really like to do crate training, because we see people adopt birds that just aren't quite there yet. How are you going to take your bird to the vet, which you should do at least once a year, just like a dog or a cat, if you can't get them from the cage into a carrier? Okay? you're going to do something that's probably aversive to that bird, and it's going to hurt your relationship. So I like to train it. Would you like to go into this carrier? Oh, look, there's a walnut in there. Would you like to come toward me? And I'm going to go get to the back of the carrier and see if you want to come toward me, because I seem to be a reinforcing presence for this bird. And we know because they move toward things they want and away from things they don't. So those are the things I start with. You can teach anything. That's the amazing thing. You can teach them to discriminate colors. I went to a chicken training workshop, and we trained them to touch a particular shape. We taught them to touch I think it was a mark we had put on different things, and they would distinguish which one to touch because there was only one that had the mark. Chickens. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What about you mentioned birds are intelligent. Do you know, like, what is the most intelligent bird and the least intelligent bird?
That's a great question. So you're going to be very surprised by this answer. They all have the same brain. The small ones just have a smaller enclosure for their brain, but all the structures are the same. I remember asking a vet who's phenomenal, she's nationally known, years ago, do they have the same number of cranial nerves as humans? And she said, yes. How about that? I had no idea. And the size of the bird, and therefore the size of the brain, does not indicate that one bird is more intelligent than another. Okay? I'm going to blow your mind because you started with this and I tucked it away immediately, just waiting to use it. The parrot with the largest vocabulary, documented by the Guinness World Book of Records, got a guess?
I don't know, parakeet, I guess.
It is a parakeet at 1,748 words, I believe. 1,748 words. But frequently when I'm at Parrot U or working with the birds, somebody will come in and they'll ask questions and say, well, what do you think about having a budgie? That's the correct term, or budgerigar, for the parakeet. And they go, I don't want that. I want a real parrot. And so I always trot that out, and they have a little more respect for the budgie, and really it's more appropriate for most people. They can give the bird a budgie a huge cage and space to fly in their home. You put them a caw in there and it's a whole different ball game. So it's just amazing. In my opinion, I think that some species have a different type of intelligence. If you want something taken apart, literally disassembled, get a cockatoo. Okay? My cockatoo took the door off the cage from the inside of the cage with recessed screws. To this day, I do not know how he did it. I just heard a huge crash and went in there, and he was sitting on the door sill and looking at the door, which is 3 feet tall, by the way, and he weighs 1.3 pounds. That was impressive. They're escape artists. Some of them can get out of just about anything. So you have locks, you have duct tape, you have a variety of things to keep them in. Some are good at solving puzzles. There's been some great research done with Goffin's cockatoos on tool use. They use tools to get to what they want. Now, we thought that only things like crows and ravens did that. Nope, Goffin's cockatoos can do it too. If you want a bird that talks, all of them have the physiology, the physical anatomy that would enable them to talk. It doesn't differ. We know that there tend to be some trends. So if you're looking at budgies, the males tend to be better talkers than the females. Now, having said that, you'll probably meet a female tomorrow and she'll chatter away, but it tends to be. And cockatiels, they tend to be better whistlers than talkers, and the males tend to do the whistling. It kind of makes sense if you think about it, because if the female is on the nest, she's not going to be calling attention to herself by whistling Pirates of the Caribbean. So it kind of makes sense to the males. And maybe that is a way of attracting the female's attention too. Who knows? African greys, which you mentioned as well. So African greys, they tend to have intelligible speech, easier to understand. Some of them have large vocabularies, but there are some that never talk, some that talk for a while and then stop and never start again, some that you don't think talk because you've never heard them talk. Put them in the car and they're singing and carrying on and telling jokes and whatever. And so the environment is so related to behavior. right now we've got an Amazon at Parrot U. I love this bird. I get very emotionally attached to the birds that I work with. This is an older guy. We don't know much about him because he came from animal control. He does have a cataract in one eye, which is one of the things we're basing that he is an older bird on. He loves to talk, not necessarily in human speech. So you can walk up and say, hi, and he may echo the hi, and then he just looks at you and goes, and then you start to hear a word or two. So he has a New York accent with some things, and he go, oh my God! And I'm trying to teach him to sing E-I-E-I-O so we can do Old MacDonald. But he will do that with you as long as you want, going this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So that's a different type of intelligence. It's not an African gray. It's an Amazon instead. But he's clearly using his vocal skills to get attention, to get proximity. It's probably enriching for him.
Yeah. What when it comes to training them to talk, like how do you even go about that?
The same way you do with children, mind-numbing repetition. And I think it's easier to start with 1 or 2 syllable words and something that you don't mind saying all the time. And keep in mind, if you are successful and that bird learns to say that, how many times a day do you want to hear it? Because you can't say, okay, we're done with that now. Move on. No, that's not the way it works. They refine their speech usually at night, and this is based on some beautiful research of parrots in the wild. And they will mutter. I've heard it with lots of birds that we've had in our homes over the years. It just mutter, and then you'll hear one little clear sound. They're refining the speech. And you don't start hearing the words usually until daylight hours. At some point when they've got it down pat, they'll start to trot it out. Really interesting. And of course, there's the big debate on whether they use it purposefully. If every time, it's probably based on us and them in combination. So if every time the bird says nut, you run and get a nut and deliver it, my bet is he says nut and he understands nut, okay? Because of that pairing process.
Yeah. Also, what is the longevity of different birds? I've heard that some birds live really long, like over 100 years. And
yeah, so this will blow your mind too. When I was a kid and we had budgies, parakeets, we thought that the life expectancy was 1 to 2 years. That's about what they lived. Well, we fed them an all-seed diet, which was the standard of care at the time. And we would not have known that some things were toxic, some foods were toxic to birds. We would not have known that some foods were high in fat and therefore would create health issues. So if we fed an all-seed diet, we basically fed that bird a huge amount of fat. They probably developed heart disease from a high-fat diet, and that's why they died in a year or two. Now we're seeing budgies that live 20 to 25 years. That is more the standard, because we know what to feed them now. We can provide far better care. My parents had 6 kids. They would never have thought about taking a parakeet to the vet. Probably couldn't have found a vet to take a parakeet to at the time. And then with the longer lived birds, you're talking African grays, Amazons, cockatoos of different sizes. There are many different types of cockatoos, and macaws. You do hear the 100 years. I would argue that that's probably pretty rare. Well, how would you measure that in the wild when you think about it? That would be pretty hard to track an individual for 100 years. And it's going to depend on so many things. It's going to depend on the diet primarily. It's going to depend on the quality of care you're giving them. They get the same disease as humans get. You see birds with arthritis. I mentioned the Amazon with a cataract. You do see heart disease and liver disease and kidney issues. You see physical things such as bumblefoot, which is sores on the bottom of their feet because they don't have the proper perches in their cage. If somebody puts all dowel rods, if you think about it, that bird's foot never changes position. A dowel rod has exactly the same diameter from one end to the other. So the pressure points from that bird's foot, it's always going to be the same. So it'll start to look slick like an onion peel at first, and then it gets pink, and then it gets red, and then it gets a sore. They don't sleep laying down. So how do you heal something like that? It's really challenging.
Yeah. So Any other interesting stories that you want to share about whether it's your life or related to birds?
If you are interested in birds, or if you are thinking about the possibility of bringing a bird into your home, find a bird rescue or sanctuary or whatever we want to call it near you and go and visit a lot. Okay, you're going to have the opportunity to see different species there, which you can't see in a pet store. In North Carolina, they can't have big birds, so you're only going to see conures and down from that. So you're not going to get a chance to meet an African gray or an Amazon or a cockatoo or a macaw. And if you're going to one of these places, you're probably going to get a healthy dose of reality. So if you walk in and your ears start to ring because they're all yelling for whatever reason, that's going to be the same in your home in certain circumstances. So if you say, I can't tolerate that, then you probably need to get a fish instead. It's a budgetary thing too. So if you can't commit to the cage and the toys and the purchase and the food and the vet bills and the carriers and replacing a lot of those things on a regular basis, it might not be the best idea for you either. So do your research. And from my personal perspective, we still have people breeding birds, but if there are birds or dogs or cats or horses or chickens or any other living organism in a rescue facility that needs a home, why would you not get an animal from there? And one of the things that people will say to me is, I don't want someone else's problems. And I say, well, how would you know, for starters? And just because they learn something doesn't mean that you can't teach them an alternative behavior, okay? So that's not a good enough reason. So, but do your homework. Don't make a rash, impulsive decision. Don't go to one of the big box stores and come home with a parakeet or a sun conure or a green cheek conure because it was cute. You know nothing about that bird. I happen to know that there's a store in the area that probably gets breeders when they're a certain age, because it's just really unusual that they always have birds that are a certain age and they don't have young one. Well, I'm using young, say 4 to 6 months. Okay, they're getting 1 to 2 year olds. What's that all about? And have these birds been vetted? The rescue that I've mentioned several times, when the process is when someone surrenders a bird or a bird is found outside, that bird is quarantined for a minimum of 30 days. During that 30-day period, the bird goes to an avian vet, okay? Their anatomy is very different from dogs and cats, so you need somebody who specializes in that. They are given a full physical, including blood work, so that we can certify that, to the best of our knowledge, that bird is healthy. Okay. If not, the bird is treated for whatever is needed. And then the bird comes into the program where I will work with them depending on the size. I just can't spread myself any thinner than I am. So I'll work with all the medium to large birds that I can get to in a 2-hour period on Fridays. But then the people are required to take classes. And they're online. They're free. Okay, there are 2 that are required for adoptions. There are many more offered. You can take a food class. You can come and take a behavior class from me. You can take a training class from me. So you've got all kinds of options there. And then the process is you sign a document. You agree not to breed the bird, not to give the bird away, not to sell the bird. If you cannot care for the bird, it comes back to where it came from, and we start the whole process over again. So that's the essence of being a good bird owner. I think that you are looking forward to the future of your bird. And my personal thing that I tell people all the time is that my definition of a good bird owner is one that gives the bird skills to succeed in the next home. Because we can't control if we lose our job or we have an illness or I remember an elderly man who lost his wife and the bird belonged to her, and then he lost his house and he showed up in a Volkswagen Beetle in front of the store with her bird in it and begged us to take the bird. He couldn't control those things. It was heartbreaking.
Yeah. So how can people reach out to you if they have questions or if they want to get their birds trained?
Awesome. So you can reach out to me at Parrot P's and Q's, P-S-A-N-D-Q-S, .com. That's my at gmail.com. That's my email address. And then you can find me on Facebook at Parrot P's and Q's. Again, no apostrophes, PSANDQS. And you can see me in training. You can see the variety of birds that I've trained. You can Google, search a term, like if you wanted to know more about foraging, just type in foraging and you'll see videos and pictures and posts and things like that. I think that it will give you a science-based understanding of what it is like to have a bird in your home, and that's important. We live in an age where we can get a lot of information with very little effort. The question is, how much of that information is accurate? And I see information being shared on Facebook that was once thought to be accurate and now been disproven. Was never accurate, but was folklore, and it's still being shared. And information that is flat harmful to you and or your bird. And that breaks my heart. And it's you could spend literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week trying to combat that and get nowhere. So I share my page, and that way I can control that little piece of the world.
Yeah. And you also have a podcast. So what is your podcast? And then if you could also mention the center where the birds are.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start with the center since we're wrapping up our bird segment. So the place is Parrot University in Pineville. If you're familiar with Pineville, it's in the Pineville Town Market, and there's a Burger King there and a Food Lion there. We're a couple of doors down from the Food Lion, and there's a nice sign up there that you can see it. They have kind of strange hours, so check out the hours before you go. COVID made them reduce their hours, so it's 12 to 2 and 4 to 6, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. I think it's 12 to 5 on Saturday and Sunday. So do check before you go. And they welcome visitors. We welcome people to come in, and the birds get a chance to be socialized better that way by seeing a variety of people. You may find a bird you fall in love with, or you may find a bird that falls in love with you. I've seen that happen as well. So that would be awesome. And you may very well see me there at some point. I'm there working with people who are taking their birds home and training the birds as well. So switching gears to the podcast. Remember I said we don't have to be one thing when we grow up. I was asked to do a podcast 4 years ago now. It is called The Backyard Naturalist, plural. Mm-hmm. And it is about anything and everything related to nature. A friend of mine who does podcasts asked me to do it, and I said no. And he said, why not? And I said, because you need an expert. He said, you are an expert. I said, I'm not. And I feel very strongly about that. I have a lot of environmental certifications, and most importantly, met a lot of experts when I was earning those. So I know experts, but I don't consider myself to be an expert on all of this. And he really bugged the heck out of me and a friend of mine who owns Backyard Birds in Matthews. And we told him no and no and no. And then COVID hit, and he stopped asking because the radio station was closed to outside traffic. And we thought, well, finally, we're done with this, right? As soon as it reopened, he came back again. And I said to my friend Laurie, let's just do this. We know that we're not the right tools for this job. We're going to bomb miserably, and he will stop. So we recorded several episodes, and here we are going into our 4th year. We have listeners in all 50 states. North Dakota was really hard to get. They were the last holdout. We have 125 countries around the world. He just texted me last night and said we hit 75,000 listens. So I guess we do have something to offer people. And sometimes it's just the two of us doing a show on something. And sometimes it's an expert that we bring in from across the United States just to talk about, let's say, the spotted lanternfly infestation, to talk about chronic wasting disease and the white-tailed deer. We want people to help by being citizen scientists in some of this stuff, because the researchers can't get out there in all locations looking for these things. But if, say, deer hunters can report a deer that's staggering around, acting really oddly, that you walk up to and it doesn't move, your eyes on the ground for the people that are studying these things. You can report it, and that's part of how they track where is this disease progressing to. So we think that information like that's really important, and we have some really fun, good feedback from our clients asking for help with problems. One person recently said, "How can I get my husband on board?" And she said, I would call this sleeping in separate beds. And we all laughed. And so we did call the episode Sleeping in Separate Flower Beds. So we gave some ideas for how you might, using behavior science, actually, just like the training, very carefully bring somebody into the fold, a tiny baby step at a time. And we're waiting to get some feedback from her as to whether it worked or not.
Yeah.
So it's been an amazing journey, and it's so much fun. We're still so surprised. We're still talking about how surprised we are going 4 years into this. How long have you been doing this?
I've just been doing this for about a year,
Okay.
not even quite a year.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's definitely like I like bringing people on from different perspectives, different walks of life, professionally and personally, and just kind of learning from people.
Yeah, yeah.
It's definitely fun.
Exactly. We on this podcast, one of our goals was to have a whoa moment. And our producer kept saying, "Aha, no, that was taken by Oprah. So we're going to have a whoa moment instead." And those are the things that we remember when a guest says something and we say, "What did you just say?" And that's something that people they'll remember, that little tag, that little hook, even if they don't remember everything in the episode, they remember that. Did you know that snapping turtles breathe through their butt?
No.
Listen to the episode on snapping turtles. That was our whoa moment for that.
Yeah. Wow.
I know, right? Our producer thought that we were setting him up to tease him and play a joke on him. So he's just playing along, and then he "Are you serious?" "Yes, we're serious." We had an expert talking about this. You think he's just playing a joke on you?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all this wealth of knowledge on birds and training and all of that. Definitely learned quite a bit, and makes me want to do even more research before getting a bird.
Yeah, good. There are so many free classes you can take. So Companion Parrots Rehomed offers free classes. Phoenix Landing, which is in Asheville, offers free classes, all virtual, so online. Some of them you can take at your own pace. You don't even have to sign up for it at a particular time. So do your homework. Bring your kids and come to Parrot U and have your mind blown.
Yeah. I think I will.
Great.
I'll bring it. I'll bring my boys. The older one definitely had some birds before we moved to Charlotte. So yeah, I mean, we like animals, so why not?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you again.
You are very welcome.
All right.